All right, we got our attendees coming in and we're going live on YouTube. Give us one moment for the broadcast to start. That worked. Hi, everybody. I'm Paul Grand, CEO here at MedTech Innovator. This is part of the MedTech Innovator Live series of webinars that we do for the companies in the MedTech Innovator cohort each year. We have 50 startups in our main cohort, about half in the early stage, half in the later stage. We're focused on medical device, diagnostics, and digital health. We've been spending the last few months working together to address common challenges and to accelerate these companies. This series is part of that, so we have different topical discussions to talk about things that our startups are concerned with, and specifically questions that they have related to the topics that we'll be discussing. So today's webinar is going to be on mergers and acquisitions, specifically in the context of MedTech. So again, MedTech being devices, diagnostics, and digital. We've got a great panel that we're going to be privileged to share with you today. I'm going to introduce the panelists so you can get a chance to get to know them. First, let me introduce Ben Johnson. So Ben is with Silicon Valley Bank. He's going to tell you about himself and what he does for Silicon Valley Bank a little bit, and specifically in the MedTech space, you know, what his role is at Silicon Valley Bank. So welcome, Ben. I'll let you do your introduction.
All right, thanks for having me, and thanks everyone for participating today. I'm very much looking forward to having an interesting dialogue about M&A in particular. And as for myself, I'm a 12-year veteran of Silicon Valley Bank. I'm about 20 some odd years into my career in the world of commercial finance. And my current role at SVB is to lead our pre-Series A life science business nationally for the United States, which consists of companies in the MedTech, tools, DX, digital health, and biopharma sectors. Leading up to that role, which I'm about 18 months into right now, I spent about a decade leading the life science business unit for SVB for basically between the mountain ranges, sans Texas, and the United States, financing into life science companies of all stages. I'm a Minnesota resident, and I've spent all of my career at SVB living from Minnesota. You're seeing my home in the background. I'm actually dialing in from home today. And so my enthusiasm around MedTech has a lot to do with the fact that most of the companies that I've been financing over the years have been MedTech in orientation. And so very happy to be here for those reasons. More broadly, Silicon Valley Bank, I would use the analogy that I actually use the Medtronic analogy, where if you think of Medtronic as being the largest pure play medical device company in the healthcare industry, Silicon Valley Bank is the largest pure play innovation banking bank in the banking industry. And so we are a full service bank. We offer full banking solutions to companies in the innovation economy, technology, life science. And we've been doing it for about 40 years. We're a publicly traded company with almost 4,000 employees spread out around the globe, including places like China and the UK and so forth. And our mission is to help improve our entrepreneurs' chance of success. So everything that we do is about trying to ensure that innovators and disruptors are optimizing their chances for success. And then we believe that as an organization, we will succeed accordingly. So again, happy to be here.
And maybe as a quick follow-up, Ben, so when you say, you know, you're doing anything you can to help optimize their chances for success, so what are some of the things that, you know, you do for clients that, you know, maybe people don't think of their bank providing that service?
Yeah, thanks. So there are a couple of things that we do that are highly differentiated relative to the rest of the world of banking. The first of which is that we employ people who are enthusiastic about a particular industry segment, and then we create thought leadership to support that enthusiasm. And so a great example of that is something that I'll be getting into in a little bit here, which is a report that we produce twice a year called the Healthcare Exits and Investments Report. And it's something that we publish so that we can take all the information that we basically gather throughout the year through our interactions with clients in the market and try to do something productive with that in a scalable way. And so for us, our market share of the venture-backed community in life science is around 60 or 70% on any given day. So 6 out of 10 or 7 out of 10 companies who are in life science or MedTech generally, and are venture-backed generally do business with us. And so then we take that information in concert with publicly available information and come up with a very robust data set to try to come up with what we think are market driving activities and investments and exits that we think are helpful. And then, so our clients appreciate the ability to not only have availability of that information, but also to be able to interact with bankers who know more than the average bear about the healthcare and life science industry, in my case, or in the technology industry, in the case of our tech sector. So that's one thing. From a product standpoint, most products in banking are highly commoditized, but one of the products that we actually invented the product, which is called venture debt, something that we've been doing for 35 years and is a very creative and strategic way of helping companies both manage their valuation and provide runway extension and manage their milestone activity using a minimally dilutive debt instrument as opposed to equity. And so there are very few financial institutions in the United States that try to offer that product. And we were the category originator for that product and the market leader in that product as well. And so when you combine creative strategic capital instruments like venture debt alongside what we think are some of the best insights in the industry for healthcare and life science, we think that that's a compelling offering for our client constituency. Great.
Thank you very much, Ben. I appreciate that background, and it's great to have the originators of venture debt to talk to today. So we'll talk more about that maybe later. I'm going to move on to Marc Chaput. So Marc is with Gravitas Healthcare, a partner there, and he's going to tell us about Gravitas and what they do in the MedTech space. So Marc, take it away.
Great. Happy to be here. Good to see you again. So I'm Marc Chaput. I'm based in San Francisco. I've been doing medical device banking for a little over 20 years now. I began my career doing buy-side equity research in Boston, and then came out here to San Francisco a little over 20 years ago to go work at the old Alex Brown. We were bought by Deutsche Bank, so I did medical device banking there for about 7 years, then went to Cowen to help restart the medical device practice there. Stayed there for about 4 years, and then my partner, Sam Navarro, and I started Gravitas about 10 years ago. And what we do at Gravitas is work with just in the emerging growth medical device space. So we just do medical devices and focus on the emerging growth end of the spectrum. We get hired by boards and by management teams to help create alternatives, which in this world typically means M&A, but it can also mean strategic investments. It can also mean distribution deals, which are typically structured as kind of the dating before the marriage. But again, it's my partner Sam and I, and we just work in this space. So look forward to this dialogue.
Great, thank you very much, Marc. Great to have you here again. So I'm going to go back over to you, Ben. And you mentioned something earlier, the Silicon Valley Bank Healthcare Investment and Exits Report. It's something that I looked forward to each year in the way that people might look forward to Christmas and they're getting their presents. I look forward to my my SVB report because I want to see what's happening every year. So I always look forward to that. And we've shared that in the past with our startups. We always provide that as one of the assets we want people to have as a reference. And I know you just did your mid-year update, as you said a couple months ago. So maybe just quickly, you can share some of the highlights from that update and some things that maybe our companies might be interested in hearing that indicate some trends and things they should be aware of as in respect to investments and exits. So I'll let you start with that.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks. And so this report is available on svb.com. It is publicly available. I think you have to subscribe to our list to get access to the report. And the information that I'm going to run through quickly here is you could reference it real time as if we were going through a slide deck together. And so I'll reference the slide number and so forth and talk about it. But the report itself is divided into two categories. One of which talking about the investment landscape for the various subsectors of life science. And then the latter half of it talks about the M&A landscape for the various subsectors of life science. And so what I'm going to focus on right now is the M&A exit landscape for device, tools, DX, and for digital health. And I have it here in front of me, and I'm going to cheat like crazy while I'm delivering this message and this monologue. So hopefully y'all bear with me there. But if you want to follow along, hopefully you can. And otherwise, we're going to just take off here and see how this goes. So the first slide that I want to reference is slide number 30, which is the device exits slide, talking about both IPA and M&A activity in the device sector. And the couple things that I want to point out about what's going on in device is that you'll notice that in 2017, 2018, 2019, we went from 14 M&A exits in 17 to 19 M&A exits in 2018. And through the first half of 2019, we've already had 10 exits in the device field. And if you look at the valuations that sort of follow that exit activity, one of the things that you'll notice is that since 2016, which is sort of a bottom, both upfront and milestone valuations have gone up and to the right. And so through the first half of this year, aggregate M&A upfront valuations have been at around the $5 billion mark. And when you add on the milestones, you're looking at almost $8 billion of value created compared to last year. This is for just the first half of this year. But if you compare that back to the full year last year, valuations on upfront were in the sort of the $3.5 billion range, with milestone valuations getting it up to about a $5 billion total for the year. So it feels like this year has been a really good year for device in terms of both the end of activity as well as the valuations that go along with it. So, so that's sort of high level what's happening with device. The next slide after that, slide 31, talks about what's happening with actual median upfront and median total deal sizes for venture-backed device exits. Now, these are exits, these are what we call big exits, which are exits that have at least $50 million of upfront. And what's curious about this is that through the first half of 2019, the median upfront actually declined from 190 million down to $115 million, whereas the median total deal size hung in there at around $220 million compared to $225 million from last year. The other thing to point out here is that the J&J Oris deal sort of was the big sort of center stage thing that happened in the first half of this year in terms of what is influencing. So if you flip back to the previous slide, you'll notice that has a big influence on the total activity level in terms of dollars. Whereas if you look at the actual median upfronts across the board, it's actually gone down. So there's some interesting activity there for us to try to digest. The next slide, which is slide 32, talks about 510K. And the thing I want to say about 510K is that this to me represents what I think is the return of the health of the MedTech M&A market. 510K is the bread and butter of the MedTech industry. And we're seeing just improvement in exit activity, both in terms of valuations and in terms of time to market and so forth. And that just tells me that the MedTech market is actually sort of coming off the bottom and going back up into the right again. So very happy to see what's happening in the 510K world. There's also, I have more detail on sort of breaking it down between de novo and PMA as well, but I'll maybe hold off on that for now.
Yep.
And then switching over to DX and tools. Interestingly, in 2017, there were no M&As in that sector. There were 10 M&As in 2018, and through mid-year 2019, we're sitting at about 4 M&As. The thing that is a little, I guess, interesting or concerning is that if you look at the valuation activity year to date this year compared to last year, there's been a significant fall off in actual valuation activity. So the M&A upfront total value through this year, year to date, was, less than $500 million, probably $400 million, I would say, in upfront. But then there was a ton of IPO market cap activity that brought that number actually all the way up to over $3 billion of activity. So we've seen some activity in the IPO world, 2 deals totaling almost $3 billion of valuation. And then the other 4 deals only amounting to about $400 million of valuation activity. And so right now, Tools DX feels like it's a little bit down relative to what we've experienced last year, but actually better than the year before, which had no activity. So DX Tools is definitely trailing right now, at least in terms of the math that we're seeing. There are some more detail on slide 34 in our investments report, exits report, where we're noticing median upfront going from $126 million in 2018 down to almost 70 million in 2019, and median total almost approximating the same. You have 160 million going down to around 80 million. So we're definitely seeing sort of across the board some downward pressure on valuations and exit activity in Tools DX. So digital health, I won't spend very much time on, only because this is the first time we've actually put any data on digital health into this report. I've always thought of digital health as really the Wild West of healthcare and life science, where we've only recently seen our first IPOs and seen our first true exit, true mega exit. And so I think what's happening is that the fact that we're starting to finally see some exit activity is leading us into what I think is going to be a dramatically interesting future for the digital health industry. It's just that we haven't seen a lot of interesting data yet, and we're just starting to see that right now. I'm very excited, though, and we're not really here to talk about this today, but I just want to make the point that I'm very excited about the fact that digital health is capturing a significant amount of investment right now, and there's a ton of interest in the digital health world, and I think a few of these exits are going to make that available investable capital get put to work. And so I'm very optimistic and interested in the future of digital health. And so I thought I'd leave it at that and turn it back to you.
Thank you very much, Ben. So that's definitely a great stage to set for the conversation here. So good data. I shared the link with our startups in the chat box. If anybody wants to download that who doesn't have it already as a reference, but it's just good to have that report in front of you at other times, not just on this panel today. Definitely something to have as a reference when you're kind of thinking about the opportunities that are in front of you. Certainly, the overall numbers aren't predictors for any particular startup, but kind of good to know what's happening in the space. One of our startups just asked, kind of in your opinion, Ben, why do you think diagnostics are struggling? In your opinion.
So here's the thing: is we're really good at coming up with the data. We're not always really good at knowing what that data means. So not having the ability to actually be the direct equity investor and actually feel that process, I think puts me at a little bit of a disadvantage just to know exactly what's going on. So I don't know. I don't know if I have a good answer for why we think that's happening. I'm sure there is a good answer, and there might be some details buried in our in the fine print in our deck that might go into it a little bit more. But off the top of my head, I don't have a good answer.
Oh, that's fine. That's absolutely fine. Thanks for that. Thanks for that answer, anyways. All right. So Marc, let me head over to you now for a minute, and just ask, first of all, just kind of directionally, in terms of trends, if there's anything that you want to comment on, having heard a little bit of what Ben had to say, but maybe just in general from your own observations. Obviously, besides SVB's report, I'm sure you track this space. You talk to strategics, you kind of have a pulse on what's happening. Are you seeing any particular trends or anything that you might want to highlight briefly?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the SVB work is, it's a fantastic piece. I was just flipping through it myself. Maybe just to add a little bit to that, I think the thing to bear in mind is we're just coming out of a couple of years where the consolidators were spending a lot of time consolidating amongst themselves. So whether it was the Abbott St. Jude deal or other deals like that. And as a result of that, I think what you saw is that, the bar got a little bit higher for 510K products. Just, a couple of reasons. One, there were fewer homes when the consolidators consolidate. So if you had, 5 natural buyers before, maybe you're down to 4 natural buyers in any particular vertical. That makes a big difference. And then in order to make a difference in that combined company, just from a critical mass perspective, it is in order to move the needle. If you're not really very strategic, having more revenue oftentimes is a result. So I think what we ended up seeing, again, on average, every company in every situation and every vertical is different, is that the bar just got higher. So before, if you had pilot commercialization, pilot results, so a minimal amount of revenue, maybe you need a little bit more than you needed before, and you're just not seeing as much activity on the pre-approval type asset. Again, every situation is different, but certainly as a result of the consolidators consolidating, the profile of the company, especially in the 510K space, has tended to get more mature and more de-risked.
De-risking is definitely something we hear about a lot, and we talk about a lot. So great, thanks, Marc, for that. So let's talk a little bit, maybe in some specifics, quickly about I'm going to go to you again, Marc. Maybe quickly just share with us an example of a recent deal that you've been involved with, and kind of what the process was like for that company. So again, maybe just tell us kind of were you representing the buyer or the seller,
sure.
Length of the process. Just again, just overview, just so we can get just a general context.
Yeah, and again, I work on the emerging growth end of the spectrum, so my set of experiences might be different than others who have are working with companies with 10 million in revenue or 40 million in revenue. Again, I work on the oftentimes get started with pre-approval, or typically get started with pre-approval companies approaching approval and early pilot commercialization. But one experience, the deal hasn't been announced yet, but we closed it back at the beginning of the year because the company's hasn't commercialized the product yet. This was pretty typical for us, where we got involved fairly early, and when we got involved, the mandate at the time was just to help put the company on the radar screen of strategics, understanding that we were probably 2 or 3 years away from kind of the natural partnering time, which would have been right around product clearance. The process was, the company was not for sale. It was really just when we went to the BD teams, we used the conferences, in that space as a natural way to get in front of the BD teams and trying to find the champions at each of the companies to say, hey, here's the technology. We think it's interesting for XYZ reason. Here's the timeline of what they're going to be doing. The company's not for sale, but we're just telling you what they're going to be doing, just so you can track it. And we use that to develop relationships with a couple of the likely buyers, also just to get on the radar screen of some of the folks that might have been the unlikely buyers. And ultimately we were successful because we did find the champion, and this was somebody that again, for an earlier stage asset, saw the strategic value and had time to bring in others into the fold, into the vision of how this could fit into the bag and help move the needle for a product that they already had. But again, it was a couple of years, and we went in knowing that it was likely going to be a couple of years. So it was really just kind of orchestrating the dance, getting on the radar screen, and then building interest around the story as the company. Fortunately, the company did everything they said they were going to do, which makes it much easier, and ultimately ended up in a good outcome.
That's really interesting. So when you talk about spending a couple of years in kind of developing that process, or at least initiating what eventually became a transaction. Is that pretty typical for you to get involved with an emerging company a couple of years in advance of a transaction, or is it a year? What's the time in which you're typically engaged?
Yeah, again, I'll speak from my set of experiences, and we work with companies earlier. But yes, I mean, a couple of years when we lock arms with somebody, there's typically an expectation on our end and on their end that it might be a couple of year process. As the asset gets more developed, closer to commercialization or in commercialization, those are times that are the process to a sale. If you want to call it a process, can be much shorter than a couple of years because from the other side's perspective, it's easy to understand and diligence the product. They're probably seeing it out in their call point already. And when you think about the different buckets of risk mitigation, for a company with 10 million in revenue, it's easy. It's typically fairly easy to go through and check that. You've got the product works. You've gone through the regulatory hurdles. IP has probably been tested. You can manufacture it. You can scale it. And then from the buyer's perspective, they can see that, how it's going to fit exactly into the bag and whether there's pull through or not. When you're an earlier stage asset, you need to weave a story and, try to, not so much convince, but let people understand how each of those specific buckets you've already thought about. And if they were to buy the product now, 2 years from now, scaling manufacturing won't be a challenge.
Sure. So, so as you said, you're working with, companies that are really early, which is great because our companies tend to be pretty early. So that's why we've got you here. And one question I just want to quickly ask, and then we can bounce back to Ben for some things, is, all this begs the question then immediately of, engaging with someone like you, whether it's, Gravitas or with somebody else, but what is that, what's that process look like? What does it cost a startup on, what should they expect in terms of, how they, how they engage with you, how you work with startups, and, how that's structured.
Sure. And I think, every situation is different. Every bank, every advisor is different, but I think in general, there's typically some sort of a retainer, and it's usually a nominal amount. And that's, from our perspective or from another bank's perspective, it's a good way of making sure that people are kind of honest about what they're doing. For them to write a check means that they're serious about embarking on this process. But, for us or for most banks, and again, every situation is different. Whether it's 90% or 95% or 100% of the expected pay comes at the time of an event, so a transaction fee. And we're, I think, no different than other folks in that, where, again, if we think we're going to make a dollar over the course of an engagement, probably 95 cents of that dollar are going to be at an outcome. So it's really structured as a win-win. We get paid when the company gets paid. But again, there are lots of flavors around that, but that's how I would think about that.
Thanks. And is it fair to think of it in terms of as a percentage, or ultimately that kind of, as you said, that event, that transaction fee to you, and what does that kind of range again look like? And not for Gravitas in general. What should people just generally expect?
Yeah. So typically, I think what you'll see is a floor and a percentage, percentages can have a wide range. A lot of it depends on the expected size of the deal.
Yeah.
So if it's a big deal, you might see 1%. If it's a smaller deal, you might see, a couple of percent. It really is just tied to the expected outcome and, whatever advisor you're talking to, what their floor, minimum kind of floor might look like. But it's, it's typically in the low single digit percentages at the time of the outcome.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Marc. So Ben, you work with early stage, and pre-seed, seed kinds of companies in your practice in particular, right? So you're out meeting with all these companies. Are you seeing people? I guess the clients you're working with, are they engaging with investment banks in this process? Is this something that in other words, I guess the question is, like, at what time are you seeing people engaging with an advisor or somebody who might help them in the kind of the way that Marc's describing?
Yeah, I align greatly with Marc's description. Companies that are in the seed stage are, I would say, probably a little bit early to be engaging on the investment banking M&A side of it. I feel like the rule of thumb is you got to be within a couple of years of that exit point on the one hand. But on the other hand, I always hear people in the industry talk about how you want to figure out who your acquirer could be as early as possible. So then the question is, how much of that onus is on you, the entrepreneur, to try to figure out yourself in terms of the social aspects of availing your technology to a would-be acquirer, and then hiring your investment banker to actually help you navigate that process and optimize it for you. I think there are two parallel processes there that have to happen. One of them is more social than the other, I think. And so socializing your idea early, I think, is a really good idea. And then, trying to get the timing right on when you want to bring someone in to actually monetize that idea, I think it has a lot to do with, the nuances of, what type of a regulatory and commercial pathway you have and so forth. And, because if you look at like the exit pathways for a PMA company, to me, it's pretty clear. Either you get picked up for $300-500 million early in your pivot trial because people can tell that this disruptive new technology is totally working, and strategics don't want to wait. And if it's not that, then your next opportunity to exit is at $30 million of revenue, which is years and years and years down the line. And so the acquirer might be the same, but like the point at which you might have something happen is going to vary dramatically based upon your clinical and or your commercial, pathway. Whereas in digital health, it feels a lot like tech in that companies in digital health get to market really quickly. You can almost, you have your minimum viable product and you're off to the races. And it's really about acquiring customers. And then a lot of companies in digital health aren't even raising venture capital. They're able to figure out how to efficiently get there and leverage their customers on SaaS revenues to perpetuate themselves, not unlike how biopharma companies leverage out licensing their technology, their future technology with strategics to raise capital to fuel their development. So, to me, I feel like there are two different angles to that conversation. Not all of them involving, the M&A transaction expert. I don't know, Marc, if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I agree. And just to add that, one of your earlier comments, do you need to, when do you need to, and when do you bring in an advisor? I always tell people, if you've done it before, you may not need to have a banker with you. Then it can come down to, the hours in the day and what's the best use of your time. And then also having a buffer ultimately on the negotiation side. But, really thinking about that as an outsourced BD function. But if you've got, board members, for instance, that have relationships within that vertical with the buyers, that can be helpful. And, maybe you don't need to bring in a banker because of that. Or if you've got, board members that have been CEOs before that have gone through sale processes, then oftentimes, they can, if the board member's got, the time and the energy to help sit alongside the CEO and the management team, then maybe you don't need to bring in a banker. But I think it just it comes down to your own situation. Have you not done it before? Do you not have the resources internally? And then even if you do have the resources, sometimes what we find, and I'm sure what most bankers find, when you've got a couple of different, when you've got 3 board members or 3 venture investors, you probably have 5 different opinions of what direction to take the company. So having someone, to sit in the middle and help manage that dialogue internally can be helpful as well.
Good, thanks, Marc, and Ben on that. You mentioned some different things before. We were talking before the webinar about other opportunities. Obviously, besides just straight, besides an acquisition, there are some things that can lead up to that, the dating before you get married. And so maybe Marc, you could talk a little bit about some things. Let's talk maybe first about distribution deals. Strategic investments. Start there. Distribution deals as an option, and what that might. What maybe either the benefits, the merits of that, or maybe the pitfalls.
Yeah, absolutely. So the distribution deals, it is something that you often see in the course of a dialogue with a strategic. So if if the dialogue ultimately ends up with an acquisition, chances are at some point, especially for the earlier stage companies, a distribution deal can be on the table. So it's just something to be thoughtful of and mindful of ahead of time. But distribution deals, can be beneficial to companies when you think about the cost of building a sales organization. Again, it depends on what vertical you're in. But that, building a sales force can, cost $5 million, $10 million, $20 million, depending, where you are, and having a large player that's already in the call point, with the bag and knows how to navigate the value analysis committees at each site, that can be helpful. So there are a lot of benefits of a distribution deal. And you do often see, because it is, the other side treats it as the dating to the marriage, you do often see it as a step before an acquisition. So it can be beneficial, but on the, there are things to be, very mindful of. One is that the economics can oftentimes be challenging to the company because the other party is going to need to subsidize the sales and marketing efforts. So as you just think about the gross margin and the operating expenses below that, are there going to be economics that are able to flow back to the company? Losing control of the touch point with the customer or with the user is something to be very mindful of, especially early in a launch, where you want to be close to your customer and hear the feedback in case there's a Gen 2 or Gen 3 of the product. If that's being filtered through someone else's sales force, that can be you're not hearing it directly, and while that information might eventually get to you, it might not. You're not hearing it straight from the horse's mouth, so that can be challenging. And then also just being mindful of what does that distribution deal mean or implication wise for an eventual partnership, whether it's with that company or with other companies. So being thoughtful around being able to get out of that distribution deal is important, whether it's a time frame or just outs and a notice period. And then also having the, again, making sure that the playing field with the other strategics is as level as possible. But then also, really being mindful about picking the right partner on the distribution side and making sure that everyone's incentives and motivations are aligned as possible. Because while this product is the most important thing to you, if that sales force is in there with 9 different products, if the sales folks think that this is challenging to sell and they try 1 or 2 times, they might move to the next thing that's easier in their bag. So making sure as much as you can that this is going to be important to the partner, and being part of that.
Thanks, Marc. You know, one of the companies threw a question into the question box over here. So the question is, you know, how significantly can giving limited distribution rights away to an early strategic partner in, you know, a region perhaps just like China affect an exit?
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, so as you think about China specifically, it is a very difficult region for a non-Chinese company to launch a product into, to get a product approved and launch a product into. So having a partner there is very important, and is, you know, 3 out of 4 times is probably the only way, or more than 3 out of 4 times is probably the only way to monetize a product. You know, if you're a US based company. But as you think about entering into a distribution deal, make sure you take a step back and understanding is, if you give up China rights, you know, again, if it's more than something that you can just unwind quickly, which, you know, chances are in China it's not going to be, because of the regulatory process and whatnot, is giving up China rights going to be a detriment to partnering with any of the other players. So having a good perspective on the landscape of who the other potential partners are and whether they care about China or not is important. Again, if you can't unwind something quickly. And, you know, we're finding more often than not, you know, people do care about China, you know, even if they don't have a presence there today, or a large presence there today. You know, it's an important part of the, you know, the 5-year plan. So it can definitely impact, again, vertical by vertical and company by company and product by product. It can definitely impact discussions with other parties. But on the other hand, you know, it is partnering China rights is a good way, can be a good way to monetize a product in a region that you otherwise might not be thinking about for 3 or 4 or 5 years down the road, and it can be you know, effectively a non-dilutive source of financing and whatnot.
Great. All right, so let's take a different area for a second here. So Ben, you know, I know, as I said, you work with a lot of early stage companies, you know, as you said, seed stage, and, you know, I'm sure the transition to A companies. As you're talking to, you know, those companies and advising them in some cases, perhaps, maybe you could tell us if you advise them, but one of the things that we see, you know, if you look at this industry long enough and you look at, you know, you look at deals for the founders, oftentimes it might be beneficial to have an earlier exit than to ride this out for a long time. Sometimes because they may wind up not being management anymore and not having the same equity at some point, or maybe because of all the dilution from all the funding rounds. As you said, some of these are pretty big rounds, and you know, the bigger exits might mean the companies have raised a lot of money. So the question I really have for you is, from you know, for the early founders, you know, maybe even the early investors in some of these companies, are there times at which it's better, you know, to take early exits, or do you have any kind of a lens on that?
Yeah, so that question reminds me of the efficient frontier. And so the question is, you know, how do you know that you're on the efficient frontier for your development as a company? And then how do you know that you're going to remain on that efficient frontier as a founder going forward? That is a really nuanced and really murky world. And we do not advise first of all, we don't advise our clients on that specifically, because what you really need is very deep subsector specific strength around you to help answer those questions. And so what we a lot of times will tell founders is that it's really important for you to surround yourself with the most credible people for what you're doing that you possibly can. The best KOLs, the most connected investors, the investment bank who understands, you know, that you know, your subsector in a way that you can appreciate. All of that is really important, and all of that is going to cost you dilution. And so, Yeah, I have a mnemonic out there that, how does it go? I can't even think of how it goes now. Having to do with this idea that 10% of a billion is 10x more. I think that's how the math goes. 10x more than 100% of 10 million. Those of you who are really mathematical can fact check me on that. But the idea is if you can get to $1 billion valuation and take 90% dilution along the way, you'll probably be financially better off. You'll probably be on that efficient frontier in a better way. But it's hard to conceptualize that when you're at the seed stage, because taking that much dilution in your company seems crazy. It seems like you're gonna do all the work and get none of the credit. And so this is really, to me, this process is about optimizing the development of the technology with thought leadership around you and doing what it needs to be done mathematically in order to get there. And so then if the exit point then happens to be earlier rather than later, and that you believe that the advice around you with its credibility is guiding you toward that, that you're doing that on the efficient frontier, then it's going to want to be done earlier rather than later. But I think a lot of times too, the market sort of dictates that, and you really, I think, have to kind of go through the process and pick your investors as if you're not going to have an exit until later. Because one of the big pitfalls that early stage companies fall into is they raise capital from investors who don't have deep enough pockets to endure significant delays in progress or significant delays in exit. And then you end up having a cap table problem. And the next thing you know, you're getting down rounded by a new investor who's taking financial advantage of the fact that the investors that you have just don't have any dry powder left. And we saw that happen all the time back in 09, 010, 011, when it was hard to find capital, and companies who were 3 or 4 years in had their investors saying, sorry, I can't see this one all the way through, on the one hand. On the other hand, I'll use the company CVRX as an example, if any of you are familiar, who they just announced that they got PMA approval for their product. They've had investors who've been in there for 15 years, and they are investors who have 15 years worth of dry powder capability. And so you're going to pay a premium, I think, in the form of dilution to have access to 15-year-long, sort of capital window. But if you think that your pathway might take that long, you're better off doing that, I would say, than rolling the dice and taking capital from someone who has a 3-year half-life or whatever. And so I think getting that right is an iterative process. I think it involves surrounding yourself with the right people who can help guide you, inform you in that process. And then through collaborating on that, I think you get to the right answer. So it's just a little bit of kind of meandering on that topic from my viewpoint.
That's helpful. That's helpful, Ben. Thank you very much, Ben, on that. All right, so then let's take a different topic over here. So one of the questions that we had. Wait, Marc, can you hear me?
Oh, yeah, I can hear you now. Sorry, I couldn't hear you for a couple seconds there. I cannot hear you right now.
And I'm back. Okay.
I can hear you now.
Guys, everybody can hear me again? All right, great.
Yep.
Sorry. So let's go back, Marc, to you again then for a second. So let's just talk a little bit again about going back to M&A and just kind of the process in general. So, so first of all, general question for you, Marc, quick question, easy one, is, do you need an investment banker to affect a transaction? Or, you mentioned before, if you've done this before, maybe you don't need a banker, but in general, do you need a banker?
I mean, I think in general, no. But there are circumstances when a banker can certainly be helpful. But I think most situations, if you're in a defined vertical, if you know who the likely parties are, if you've got the context and the time to do it, and again, maybe a board or others that can be helpful, then no, you don't need to hire a banker.
And you have a good lawyer too, in there somewhere.
Yeah, and that is very important. That's money well spent.
Yeah, that's definitely money well spent. Okay, and then also, one of the things that people always try to figure out is, they're talking to one strategic, perhaps. The question always comes up is, how do you create leverage? Should you be creating leverage and trying to talk to others, what's your thoughts kind of on that process in general?
Yeah, I think in the device space, the way to create leverage is to have, the party that you're talking to think that you're in discussions with others, or that there are other natural homes. If someone thinks that, they're the best buyer or they're the only home, they're going to have all the leverage in the world. But, having a story that's articulated such that if you're, one buyer, you can see how, this could fit into the bag of others, probably most importantly, your number one or number two competitors. That's the way to create the most leverage. Because again, if you're a BD person, you want to do deals, but you also want to, preserve your job, and, you lose your job by doing bag deals. One of the ways that you get comfort that you're, sticking your neck out on something is if you can articulate that there might be others out there, in your peer group that are viewing this opportunity the same way. And again, it just kind of gets back to, getting on the radar screen early, and just casting a wide net of who, who's aware of the opportunity.
Yeah, no, I think that's great advice. And that's one of the reasons we even created MedTech Innovator, was just to be able to get people on the radar earlier who typically may not be on everyone's radar. So great to hear you say that. And, one of the things that, you talked about earlier was this, this process could be a couple of years. One of our startups asked, from the time that you actually, may have like a term sheet with somebody who you might be entering into a transaction, how long does it typically take, or how do you anticipate how long it might take to go from a term sheet to an actual closed deal?
Yeah, every situation is different. A lot of it depends on how much diligence has been done up front. But I think a typical period these days is kind of 60 to 90 days, probably closer to 90, frankly. But I've seen shorter, I've seen longer. It just depends on who the buyer is, how well they know you, what kind of diligence needs to get done. And then, also just internal processes at some of these bigger consolidators. They might have, a monthly meeting to get final sign off. And if you miss that, day for whatever reason, it might be another month before, before things can get signed. But I think that, 90 days is probably a good number to work with.
Great, thanks. And this question could be for either of you. So, we've talked before about valuations. Ben, you were talking about valuations going up, going down in some cases for different markets. What are some methods for arriving at valuations now these days, especially in this space? Obviously, on a later stage company, Marc, you already mentioned, if you've got sales, you can look at multiples and things like that. But for these pre-revenue companies, what are some common methods of valuing startups that may not be in the market yet, or maybe just entering the market?
Marc, you want to go?
Marc, you can take that if you want.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So, I think the first place you look is, comparable deals. Is there a peer group of other deals that have been done recently that have the look and feel of your company, whether it's in that vertical with those buyers, stage development and whatnot? That's probably the best place to start. And again, that's, very much in the art, not the science category, because, typically, you're exciting because you're unique. So there's probably not going to be something that looks exactly like you. So you need to be thoughtful about that. And then, the other way to do it is to, be looking ahead a couple of years, and, what could this be when the profile of this company changes? and then walking it back from there.
And, and obviously, you mentioned before comps, a lot of these deals, especially pre-revenue companies, aren't public necessarily.
Yeah.
They're not publicly disclosed. So what do you do in those situations if you're trying to get at comps? Are there other strategies, other techniques you use to arrive at those numbers?
On the number front, it's market intel and just keeping your ear low to the ground. But to your point, a lot of the earlier stage, especially smaller deals when they're acquired by the Strikers or the J&Js of the world, the numbers don't get announced, even a year or two later. Sometimes it comes out in the public filings, but oftentimes they're aggregated amongst a number of deals, and it's just tough to figure that out. So just having market intel can be the way to do it.
It's a good reason to have a banker. Or somebody who's got their ear to the ground.
Or somebody that's got their ear to the ground, yeah.
Anyone who's got their ear to the ground is good. No, that's very helpful. And even, there's lots of sources for deal data, but, we find that, we tend to know much better than a lot of the public sources about what the kinds of deals are that are really out there.
Yeah, and maybe just to add to that a little bit too, the one thing to be mindful of is, when you hear a number, understanding the specifics to the deal can be helpful, because a lot of times for the earlier stage companies, an earnout is can be a large component of the deal. So if somebody says something sold for $100 million, is that the all-in number? If it's 50 upfront and 50 of an earnout, understanding the components to the earnout and what the probability of achievement was that people might have done at the time the deal was struck, because you can have a deal that's talked about as a $100 million deal, but everybody knew at the time was a $60 million deal, but a $60 million deal might have been a great deal at the time, but people will talk about it as being a $100 million deal.
Yeah, well, maybe briefly, Marc, can you just explain the earnout, and what those might look like, how those work?
Sure. So when you structure a deal, when you think about the consideration being paid, there's an upfront component. So that's what you get when the deal closes. And then in the device space, especially for earlier stage companies that still have milestones out ahead, whether it's regulatory or commercial, there's oftentimes an earnout or a milestone-based component, and it's very deal specific. But sometimes it can be 2/3 of the total value. Sometimes it could be 1/3 of the total value. As you think about the dollars that ultimately be paid for in the acquisition, and earnouts can be tied to a number of different things. Ideally, as you're structuring a deal on the sell side, having it be win-win components that are black and white, easily definable. Yes or no, you made it or you didn't make it, can be helpful, and things like that. If you're pre-approval, having a regulatory clearance, so a CE mark or a 510K or PMA, it's clear whether you made it or not. And if you're picking the right partner, it's also clear that that's something they're going to be striving for. Otherwise, unless they've got a competitive product, they're just buying you to put you on the shelf. Chances are they're going to be striving to hit that milestone so they can go out and commercialize. And then as you think about commercialization milestones, there's lots of different flavors on that as well. So units is a great way to do it if you don't have an anticipation of what the ASP is going to be, so it's not tied to a specific revenue number, or also in this world where a lot of products are getting bundled together, trying to ascertain what the revenue contribution from any product, any specific product might be challenging, just given the way the world's working on the buyer side, on the hospital buying side these days. So again, in general, structuring them as win-win, where clearly everybody should be striving for that, and then also clearly definable, so you don't get into a fight 3 years from now on on whether you hit it or not, which still happens. So trying to avoid cost of goods or gross margins or things like that. That you, from the buy side, you can see how that might make sense to them, because ultimately they're probably trying to create a model that makes sense. And if you don't hit that target, then their deal model doesn't work. But again, just putting your hat on and thinking a couple of years ahead, are there ways to complicate that from an accounting perspective or whatnot?
Good. Thank you very much for that, Marc. Very helpful. So we're going to wrap up the public part of our broadcast in a minute, and then we're going to have a private discussion with just our companies that'll be non-broadcast. Before we get to that, one of the questions that someone asked that maybe I'll put out there for both of you relates to private equity. And whether or not private equity is a viable exit strategy these days. So maybe taking some of the early investor chips off the table, building a growing sustainable business. Is private equity a viable strategy these days for companies in the MedTech world?
I don't think we're seeing a lot of it. And I would say the reason for that is it's probably really hard for private equity to wrap their brain around the almost oligopolistic type of competition that you see in the MedTech world, where as a private equity investor, how are you going to compete against Medtronic and J&J, for example, in a certain market? I think there are market dynamics that make that harder. I don't think it's impossible, but in my experience, I haven't really seen it that much. And so I would suspect that it's due to underlying market dynamics. I don't know, Marc, if you had any thoughts on it.
Yeah, I mean, you don't, for earlier stage emerging growth device companies, you don't see private equity that often. You do see it sometimes, but you don't see it that often. And really just because, from the private equity side, they are trying to typically consolidate a bunch of businesses, leverage a channel off of a large base of revenue. And, by definition, an emerging stage company is not going to be that base. And then also, the math from the private equity side, since they're layering debt on companies, to make these acquisitions, if you're pre-revenue, it just makes the math very difficult. So you'll see private equity and, private equity players in carve-outs, or, buying family-owned businesses and then wanting to layer in, other revenue-based companies. But for earlier stage companies, it's just the math. While the strategic fit might make a lot of sense, it just makes it real tough on the math side to get something that's interesting for the emerging growth seller.
Great, very helpful. Thank you. So, coming back to both of you, as I mentioned, we're going to be wrapping up the public part of the broadcast. Ben, quickly, so Silicon Valley Bank, as you mentioned, venture debt. Is that something that companies have to have in venture investments before you'll put in venture debt?
Yeah, so that conversation starts at Series A and then goes on from there. Really quickly on venture debt, it's a very strategic product. It is designed to help provide valuation management for the company. It also provides optionality around milestones and also provides runway so that when you hit your milestone and you have a little bit of time to raise your next round of capital. Venture debt is not a replacement for equity, it is a supplement to equity. So it's very important to use equity to raise enough equity to hit your milestone and then start your venture debt conversation off of that. You want to raise your venture debt either at the same time as the equity or shortly after the equity. And the other thing to keep in mind with venture debt is it's very, very sticky. Once it goes on the books, it's staying on your balance sheet until you exit. And the reason for that is no new equity coming in is going to want to be used to refinance or recapitalize debt on the balance sheet. So once you decide to take down debt, you are married to that debt partner, or you're going to have to refinance out that debt partner with a new debt partner all the way through until exit. And so it becomes a key stakeholder in your business. It's very important. So when you make that decision, you're making a long-term strategic decision. It's an important thing for a company to have. It's not always right for every company all the time. But I just want to emphasize the point that you don't want to try to leverage debt during a situation where you really should be raising equity. And a lot of companies and a lot of lenders, frankly, out there will try to do that, but that can actually disadvantage the cap table and can disadvantage the company. And so it's a strategic instrument that's sticky, that you have to be careful with and want to pick the right partner for.
Great, thank you. And so if people want to reach out to both of you and find you, obviously MedTech Innovator, we can introduce our startups directly. That's not a problem. And Ben, are you findable through sbb.com? Is that how people find you?
Yeah, you can find me there, or on linkedin.com is another great way to find me, or my email. Just you can email me, bjohnson@svb.com. Any of those are fine.
Great. And Marc, how do people find you at Gravitas? I don't think you even really have a website.
We don't have a website. That's by design. We fortunately have not had to do a lot of marketing. But yeah, you can reach me through Paul, or just email me directly. Or on LinkedIn, and my email is mchaput, mchaput @gravitas, gravitas -hc.com.
For healthcare. Okay, good.
Yeah, thank you.
Very good. Thank you for that. Thank you both for the panel. We covered a lot of great insight into what's going on. We're going to end the public broadcast, and you guys are going to stay on, so don't go anywhere, as well as our startups, and we'll give them the ability to ask them more questions directly. Thank you very much for everyone who tuned in on our YouTube channel, or medtechinnovator.org/live. We're going to have a really great product development related discussion next week. So you'll want to tune back in same time next week, or just go to our YouTube channel for MedTech Innovator. So thank you very much for tuning in today. This will conclude the live broadcast, and we'll be seeing you soon. Thank you.